Today on our show, Jimmy Akin tells us about the life of Pope Leo the Great, and Karlo Broussard answers a common Protestant challenge about baptism. All this and more up ahead.
Matthew 16 at Peter's confession about Jesus. One thing that I always wondered was at verse 20, after Peter's confession of Christ, why did Jesus strictly order his disciples to tell no one that he was the Messiah?
Sure. This is also called the Messianic Secret that you see especially in Mark's gospel on repeated occasions, that Jesus doesn't fully reveal his identity. He orders people that he tells individuals, he heals them, and he tells them, don't tell anybody about this. But on some occasions, it says, even though Jesus told them not to tell anyone, they still did. And what happened was that when those people disobeyed Jesus and they went and told others, Jesus ended up being mobbed by crowds, and he wasn't able to enter certain cities. He wasn't able to carry out the rest of his earthly mission. So there's various reasons that have been proposed for the Messianic Secret as to why Jesus delays the full announcement of his messianic status and even tells the apostles not to tell anyone about this. One reason may be a practical one, in that Jesus did not want to arouse the suspicions of the Roman authorities and the Jewish authorities too quickly. He wanted to still be able to preach and to send the apostles throughout Judea and throughout that region before it was time for him to offer himself as a sacrifice for us on Calvary. That if Jesus simply announced, I am the Messiah, well, it wasn't taken too kindly in ancient Judea. The Jewish historian Josephus records other people who bluntly declare that they were the Messiah. He talks about people like Theudas, the Egyptian, other Messiah claimants who would announce that they're Messiah. And Josephus says what happened to these people is they were either killed or they were sent off. They went off into exile because the Roman authorities clamped down on them. So if Jesus were to boldly proclaim his identity early in his ministry, that could have incited the Romans to a point. I mean, nothing's going to stop Jesus, of course, he's God. But it wouldn't have fulfilled the plans. Galatians 4:4 says that in the fullness of time, this right time and moment for God to come, not just to be born, but to be able to preach the gospel and preach it throughout Judea until that pivotal moment after his resurrection for the apostles and the disciples to be sent out throughout the world. Another reason might be that Jesus needed time in his earthly ministry to help people cultivate a different understanding of who the Messiah was, that for them, many of them saw the Messiah was simply a Davidic conqueror. When you read in the writings of Josephus, this is recorded, at least in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, that these Messiah claimants, these other people who claim to be the Messiah, they ran with a pretty straight militaristic trope about them. They would go out, one of these individuals went out into the desert, crossed the Jordan, and was going to cross with his followers back over the Jordan into Jerusalem to triumphantly retake Jerusalem. So, invoking those themes of Joshua and David and Moses and kind of a military sense of who the Messiah was. And that is not what Jesus was trying to instill in people. Remember when Jesus talks to Pontius Pilate, he says very clearly, my kingdom, he has a kingdom, but it's not of this world. So the purpose of the Messianic Secret is so that just as Jesus came at the fullness of time, at the right time, that God became man at a very particular moment when the Roman Empire had initiated the Pax Romana. There's a peace throughout the world, so that there's this extensive road networks, there's a common language. God became man at just the right time for the church to be spread throughout the world. Much the same way, when God became man, he chose to reveal his messianic identity and to send out his apostles. Apostles mean those who were sent out at the right time as well. So I think that's the two good reasons for us to understand, not to arouse Roman opposition too early, and for Jesus to help people to see that the Messiah was not merely a Davidic conquering hero, though he would ultimately fulfill conquering over evil and death to fulfill that ultimate, Davidic status. He reigns, he sits on his throne in heaven. But to help people see that the Messiah was more than just a a military figure. It's not somebody like Cyrus in the Old Testament who will liberate the Jews from temporary evil, but will liberate all people from eternal evil. So I hope that's helpful for you.
Hello again, Jimmy Akin.
Hello again, Psych Hellet.
Pope Leo the First.
Oh, what a great guy.
Really?
And a great pope.
All right, so tell us about
one
him.
of two popes that's commonly called the Great, although the title is also sometimes applied to other popes.
Well, I can think of Gregory.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and then Leo, and then some people
apply
John Paul.
And there's another one too, but yeah.
Yeah,
But
okay.
Leo's the first.
So Leo the Great.
Yeah.
When did he live?
He lived in the 400s. We're not entirely sure of the year of his birth. It's sometimes put around the year 400. What we do know is that around 430, he became a deacon.
Okay.
And he was an extremely effective deacon. The Pope at the time sent him on a peace mission to France.
Okay.
And he's entrusting a deacon with that.
Yeah.
And he became the archdeacon at Rome. And then while he was on his peace mission, he got the word that the current Pope had died, and he was unanimously elected to be his successor. And so he became Pope in 440. And he then reigned for a little more than 20 years, which was a long time for a Pope back then.
So he had to be ordained a priest and a bishop.
In quick succession, yes.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he was considered an extremely effective Pope. He did a bunch of stuff. We can distinguish between the pastoral things that he did and then the doctrinal things that he did. Now, at this point in its history, the Roman Empire was not in such great shape. There were repeated barbarian invasions.
Right.
And there was a lot of poverty and economic problems and things. And so he had to intervene for pastoral reasons. He had to play this prominent role in civic affairs because the emperor wasn't getting the full job done. So the Pope was having to step up.
Okay.
And an example of that is you may have heard of Attila the Hun, right?
I believe I recall that name, yes.
Yeah. So in 450, so this is about actually maybe 452, but it is 452. So 12 years into his pontificate, Attila the Hun is ravaging Italy.
Mm-hmm.
So he's invaded, and the emperor has a delegation, including Pope Leo, sent to meet Attila the Hun. And according to our sources, Attila was very impressed by Pope Leo, and he stopped his conquest. Now
That's amazing, isn't it? By force of his presence, by the force of his personality and his presence.
And his negotiating skills and everything like that. Now, he didn't say, okay, let's make a peace treaty and be buds now.
Yeah.
But he did stop the invasion.
Okay.
And so that spared a good chunk of the Italian peninsula of further predation by the Huns at that point. Unfortunately, a few years later, in 455, another conqueror, another pagan conqueror, I think he was a Visigoth, also invaded and got as far as sacking Rome. So his troops did get into the city. They did start plundering and, taking people's stuff, as they did. But there was also a peace embassy here as well. And even though he couldn't get the city spared of being plundered, Leo did convince them, and he went unarmed, surrounded by his clergy, and pled for the city, and he got them not to burn it.
Wow,
and
that's something.
And to spare the basilicas like St. Peter's and St. John Lateran and St. Paul outside the walls. And you had, portions of the population that were just terrified that had taken refuge in these churches, and he got them spared and things like that. So those are some of the pastoral things he did to help out in Rome and its environs.
And so what are the kind of theological or inside the church issues that he's dealing with at his time?
Well, a couple of them really stand out. One of them that he's very famous for is so there was a controversy at this time about the nature of Christ. There were some people who were called monophysites, who argued that when Christ became a human, his divine nature and his human nature sort of fused and became intermingled. So he didn't have a complete divine nature and a complete human nature anymore. It was kind of a fusion of the two. And Leo was adamant that no. He has a complete divine nature and a complete human nature. They are not divided, but they're also not confused with each other.
Okay.
And he wrote a letter known as the Tome of Leo, which was read in 450 at the Council of Chalcedon.
Okay.
And this was considered a decisive thing at the council. When the tome was read, the bishops at the council proclaimed, "Peter has spoken through Leo. And this is the faith of the Orthodox. This is what we believe. This is what the apostles taught," and so forth.
So all of Christianity after that, then, this is the standard. Like, this is a clear standard.
For Orthodox Christians.
For Orthodox
yes.
Christians. So he sets that as the standard. Even today, you would say that this is something that all Christians would basically agree on.
Yes, although people who were descended from the monophysites use different language, but even they have, in the last number of years, signed a joint declaration with the Vatican saying we agree on the substance, we just use different language to express it.
All right.
So that's one of his two big doctrinal contributions. The other is linked to it, because you know how they said Peter has spoken through Leo?
Yeah.
Well, Leo was a very strong advocate of the fact that the Pope is the successor of St. Peter, and that's the basis for his authority.
Okay.
And so he did a lot to, I mean, the idea was present before, but he did a lot to really underline that fact and make people aware that that's where the Pope's authority comes from, that it's not just that he's the bishop of a historically important city. It's that he's the successor of Peter.
Right. And this is very important if Rome is kind of losing its central role to say, why is the bishop of Rome important?
Right.
It's not because he's in Rome. It's
not because of how important Rome was historically.
Right. It's because Peter was the bishop of Rome, and he's the successor of that. All right. Well, thank you, Jimmy Akin.
My pleasure.
Oh, is he a saint?
Yes, he's a saint and a doctor of the church. In the 1700s, he was proclaimed a doctor of the church.
Well, St. Pope Leo, pray for us.
Amen.
They always come up to me, well, where does it say that in the Bible? Where does it say that in the Bible?
Right.
And I know the Catholic was the one that composed the Bible and gave it to the world.
Correct.
And it was held by bishops and elders. And my question is, when was it composed, and who are the elders?
Yes.
I mean, I tried understanding that, but I don't get that.
Well, Javier, there is an excellent book that we published that here, right? Why Catholic Bibles are bigger.
Yeah,
by Gary
Michuta. Yeah,
by Gary Michuta. It is an excellent book that gives you some good history with regard to how the Bible was put together, as well as showing why the Catholic Church has, 7 more books and parts of 2 others that the Protestants do not have. They actually threw them out as a matter of history. But it's an excellent book, Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, by Gary Michuta. But the bottom line is, when you talk about the Bible, when was the first Bible composed? It's kind of we got to tweak the question a little bit, because the Bible, as you know, Javier, is not a book. It's a collection of 73 books. And so you really have to, go back and learn how each one of these books were written, when they were written, and how they were put together. Now, the Old Testament was put together over a period of about 1,500 or 1,400 years. So it was written over a long period of time, because the Old Covenant revelation was an ongoing reality, and there was much development in their understanding over those 1,400 years until the canon of the Old Testament was completed. Then the New Testament comes along, and you have the New Testament canon, and that was written over a period of roughly about 60 to 65 years. the Gospels, the book of Acts, the epistles, and the book of Revelation, for example. And so, as you said, Javier, these books were written different times, different authors. They were then disseminated among the churches, read in the liturgies, and this is how they came to be known, is through the liturgies, where they were read around the world. And then decades later, there started to be questions, or I should say a century later, there started to be questions over which books were authentic. There were some churches, Javier, that were reading books, for example, the letter of Clement to the Romans, which was written by our fourth pope, St. Clement, to the letter to the Corinthians, actually. And scholars disagree on when it was written. I hold to in the 90s AD, but the bottom line is it was read as if Scripture in some churches for 100 years after Clement died. You had the Shepherd of Hermas. You had the Didache, which is the teaching of the 12 apostles. You had other books that were considered, the Epistle of Barnabas, and others that were considered inspired by some. And then you had books like the book of Revelation, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Hebrews, and others that were considered questionable. Some did not accept them as inspired. You even have Eusebius of Caesarea in 350 AD talking about these books, the book of Revelation, which was disputed, Hebrews, and others. And so that's when it would be Pope Damasus that would call a synod in Rome where the canon was given. Now, this was on the ordinary level. It wasn't infallible, but it pretty much put things to rest, although you would still have some disagreements here and there. It basically put it to rest for 1,000 years, but the issues would arise again. And then especially with the Reformation, throwing books out, and that's when the Council of Trent defined things infallibly. So when was the first Bible composed? I mean, that's a very difficult question. It was basically the Old Testament, as I said, over that long period of time, and the New Testament by the end of the first century. There you have the entirety of the Bible was composed by about the year AD 100. So that's a period of roughly 1,600 years that the entire Bible was composed. But recognizing which books were authentic and so forth, that would take a lot more time. Like I said, till the end of the 4th century with Pope Damasus, and even there would be more questions arise until finally an infallible canon was given by the Council of Trent. So that should get you started. Recommend that book as well, Javier.
How can the church teach that non-immersion baptisms are valid when the Bible speaks only of baptisms that were done by immersion?
Yes, and a couple of passages that our Protestant friends will appeal to in order to support their claim that baptisms are only done by immersion is, for example, in Acts 8:36 through 39, where it talks about the eunuch, right, being taken by the deacon Philip. They go down into the water, right, in order to be baptized. Or, for example, in Mark 1:10, where it's talking about Jesus' baptism, it says he came up out of the water.
Yes. And
so those are a couple of passages where they think it shows that baptism should be done by immersion alone, and thus any other form of baptism, like pouring water or sprinkling, would be invalid. And also, too, they appeal to the Greek word used in Scripture for baptism, baptizo, which literally means to immerse. So they'll conclude from that as well that baptisms should only be done via immersion. So that's the challenge.
That seems pretty convincing, actually. So
yeah, right.
Have we been doing this wrong?
Have we been doing it wrong, right? Yeah. The answer is no. So here's how we can meet this challenge. First of all, the narratives concerning Jesus' baptism in Mark 1 and the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 don't specify that immersion was the mode of baptism used. See, that's the fundamental flawed assumption. The challenge assumes in these passages it's immersion, but we can challenge that assumption.
Okay.
So, for example, just take Jesus, as Mark tells us, Jesus came up out of the water. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean he was immersed and dunked and then came up in that sense. It could very well just mean they came to the shore. He was with John the Baptist in the Jordan, and then they came up out of the water in the sense that they came to the shore out of the water, right?
Right.
And so that statement in and of itself doesn't necessarily imply immersion. Now, it's even clearer in Acts chapter 8. Verse 38 and specifically, it talks about how he commanded the chariot to stop. They both went down into the water, right? Notice that's the preceding text, because in verse 39, that's the passage that they're appealing to, saying that they came up out of the water. But notice it says they both went down into the water, not just the Ethiopian eunuch. It says both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and then, that's in verse 38, then in verse 39, it says they both came up out of the water. So if we're going to apply the logic of the challenge, we're going to have to conclude that
the minister and the receiver of the baptism have to dunk.
That's right. And that's obviously not the case. So the more likely interpretation here is that they went down into the water. That is, they went into the water together. The eunuch was baptized, and they came up out of the water together. That is, they came to the shore, right? Out of the water. So these two passages do not show that immersion was the form being used, right? Or the mode or the manner in which baptism was being used. So that's how we could appeal. That's how we could address the challenge based on those passages.
You could say that's a possible reading, but it's not necessary to read them.
It's not necessary. And that's all we have to do as a Catholic and say, hey.
Then we're not obligated.
We're not, this passage poses no threat because you can very plausibly read it in another way.
Yeah.
So it's not necessary that this is proof, this is evidence of baptism via immersion.
Mm-hmm.
It could be simply pouring, or just, going down, pouring on the head, and then coming up. And that's all we have to do to diffuse the challenge. And then, in fact, in Acts 8, I think Acts 8 actually not only shows it could be read in another way, but I think the context gives us good reason to think it's not immersion, right?
Okay, how's that?
Because they both went down to the water.
Yeah, right.
They both came up out of the water. That seems to imply that it's just talking about they went into the water, he was baptized, they came up out of the water, without any sort of implication as the mode or the manner.
What about the meaning of the word baptism to Jewish people? Would that have...
Yes, that's actually... that's an argument that I think has a little bit more traction, right?
Okay.
And because the word means to immerse, right? So you would think, hey, baptizos used baptism, so they were immersing in water. But not necessarily. Consider, for example, in Mark chapter 7, verses 2 through 4, we read about how the Pharisees and the scribes were appalled at how Jesus' disciples ate with their hands defiled, that is, unwashed. Right?
Yes.
And then in verses 3 through 4, it starts talking about how they do not eat unless they purify. The Greek word there is baptizonte. They don't purify themselves. And there are many other traditions where they observe the washing, baptismus, of cups and pots and vessels of bronze, right?
Yeah.
Notice the Greek word baptizo is being used here in reference to the purifying waters, the washing, the ritual washings that the Jews would undergo, as well as the ritual washings of the cups and the pots and the vessels, right? Now, here's what's interesting, Si. Now, somebody might say, well, yeah, that means their hands were immersed in the water, and the cups and the pots and the vessels were immersed in the water.
Right.
So that doesn't seem to help us. But watch this. The Jewish Encyclopedia, in its section on baptismal washings, right, actually talks about how these sorts of baptismal washing, particularly of the hands, may be performed either by pouring or immersion. All right?
Okay.
And it actually uses a scriptural text in the Old Testament where it talks about Elisha pouring water over Elijah's hands. And the Jewish Encyclopedia uses that as an Old Testament example of these baptismal washings. So these baptismal ritual washings could be administered by pouring. So what that shows us is at least we have in Mark, in light of this Jewish background, the word baptizo, yes, literally means to immerse, but can be associated with the pouring of water.
Yeah.
So it's not necessary for us to conclude immersion because baptizo is used. Why? Yeah. Because the word baptizo can be associated with pouring of water as well in these forms of ritual washings.
Well, you mentioned the Jewish encyclopedia, but was there any use of the word baptizo in the Hebrew scriptures or in the Old Testament? Like, were there what I mean is, were there models of baptism before Christ that we could draw on?
Yeah, that's a good question. Whether baptizo is used in the Greek Septuagint, and I'd have to do a little bit more research on that in order to see whether or not it's used in. If there's any evidence whether it can be used with regard to pouring. But we do have an Old Testament scriptural text, a prophecy, that, according, once again, to the Jewish encyclopedia, the Jews understood to be pointing to a form of baptism that would be applied in the Messianic age. So, for example, in Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 24 through 25, it's a prophecy about the time of the Messiah, and God says through the prophet Ezekiel, I will sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanness, from all your idols. I will cleanse you. I will give you the new heart, right?
Right.
Notice the sprinkling of water for the sake of cleansing. Well, according to the Jewish encyclopedia, Ezekiel is talking about baptism in the Messianic age, right?
Right. Okay. So we have a prophecy.
That's right. We have a prophecy that talks about the sprinkling of water for the cleansing of God's people, which, according to the Jewish encyclopedia, is associated with baptism in the Messianic age.
I have to say, as a Christian, it just looks so obviously like a prophecy of baptism.
And then what's even more interesting is, notice you have water there, and within the context is, giving a heart of flesh, giving you a new heart. And then also further in the context, it talks about God giving his spirit. So you have water and spirit within this context. Even the Jewish encyclopedia recognizes this a prophecy of a messianic baptism. And what does Jesus tell Nicodemus in John 3:3-5? You must be born again of water and spirit.
Yeah.
Hearkening back or alluding to this prophecy about water and spirit and a new heart, regeneration, new creation, etc.
Thanks for watching Catholic Answers. Join us on our live radio broadcast every weekday from 3 to 5 Pacific and 6 to 8 Eastern on EWTN Radio or the EWTN app. Find more videos and live streams on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/CatholicCom, or find us on Facebook simply by searching Catholic Answers. Jesus Christ is the light of the nations, and we'll see you next week on Catholic Answers.